Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica panel discussion. I'm proud to introduce some of our SICSS-Howard Mathematica alums who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Nanette. My name is Amber Mackey, and I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Pennsylvania and a SICSS-Howard Mathematica 2022 alum.
I am Andrea Adams. I'm an assistant professor at the University of the District of Columbia, and I am a 2022 SICSS-Howard Mathematica alum. And it is my honor to introduce Lindsey D. Cameron, Ph.D. Dr. Cameron is an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on how algorithmic management is changing the modern workplace, especially individuals' behaviors at work. Professor Cameron has an ongoing 5-year ethnography of the largest employer in the gig economy, the ride-hailing industry, exploring how algorithms are fundamentally reshaping the nature of managerial control.
She's currently studying how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting gig workers on different platforms like TaskRabbit, Instacart, and Amazon Flex, as well as examining how ride-hailing drivers on 3 continents navigate disputes. Professor Cameron's work has been published in leading academic journals, including Organization Science, Journal of Applied Psychology, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Process, Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior, and Proceedings of the Association of Computing Machinery and the Academy of Management. She has also published opinion pieces in Fast Company, Kiplinger's, the Society of Human Resource Management's flagship magazine, People and Strategy, and her research has also been mentioned in numerous media outlets, including Bloomberg, NPR's Marketplace, Fast Company, the World Economic Forum, CNBC, Forbes, The Skim, and Inc. Welcome, Dr. Cameron. The floor is yours.
I'm Lindsey Cameron, Assistant Professor of Management today, and I'm delighted to be with you here and just part of this amazing vision, that was created by Mathematica and hosted by Howard and run by the fabulous Nanette Coleman. And I'm here to share a little bit of my research with you today around the gig economy and frame it in a bigger conversation about the future of work. Is it here yet? If you were a little kid, you're always like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And you might be having the same thoughts about the future of work. There's all this talk about we're in the middle of the 4th industrial revolution. Will algorithms automate or augment human capabilities? I'm sure you've had many talks about this. And what actually is this AI? It's a big umbrella word that means a lot of different things. Machine learning, deep learning, intersecting with all these different occupations and industries from medicine to fintech. And when you try to grapple on what is the future of work, well, we know a lot about, or there's a lot of research that's coming online about AI and hiring. Here's an article you might have seen that Amazon creates a new AI, shaped tool, immediately starts discriminating against women, been trained on bad data. Or about bots. Many of us have interacted with chat bots, particularly after we sell a product, or we're, in the point of sale for a product, or back and forth and trying to get a problem resolved. And, if you feed these bots information that's racist or sexist, they're going to throw that back on you, which, happened with Microsoft. And then they had to sort of bring back the automated bot. And then lastly, you might have seen this if you've been to a bakery in China. Japan, a bakery in Japan. Maybe you've been there, maybe you've not. But at this bakery, they found that all these unique different pastries were the ones that, most commonly sell. So they made 150 treats a day. The actual cashiers can't remember which of these 150 treats a person is buying at any one time. And so they've actually used AI in their checkout line in a bakery to sort of determine and bring up the pastry. So looking at these really diverse examples, you wouldn't, I would understand if you were confused on what exactly is the future of work. And so, I see the future of work as this big umbrella term that actually is composed of 4 different subcomponents. Who is doing the work? Are they gig workers? Is it being crowdsourced? When and where the work is being done? How is the work being managed? Is new forms of managerial hierarchy or unhierarchy, such as the case of holacracy? And then lastly, who's helping with the work? And that's where we see AI, robotics, and automation fit in. So I'm going to step us through each of these different buckets around the future of work, so you can get a sense of, what's been done in the area, and hopefully where there are future questions that'll, be addressed by you in your research and hopefully in your dissertations. So who does the work? So when we think of traditional work, we think of a standard 9-to-5 job where you go to the office. This were the type of TV shows that I was raised on. So I was raised in the generation of the Cosby Show, married to Tyler Moore, were on reruns at Nick at Night. One thing that's clear about all this type of work, it's standard employment where you're going to a job that's supposedly be continued indefinitely under the employer's location, under the employer's supervision. And just this thought of going into the office every day creates these sort of pressures around being the ideal worker, i.e. available 24/7 and devoted to the work. Now, there's a small aside about what we thought of as standard work, actually really only applied to white men up until maybe the 60s or 70s. People who are Black and brown traditionally have always had sort of non-traditional or non-standard work arrangements. But just to give you a sense, when I say standard or traditional work, this is what I mean. So how many of you have had an internship, contract job? That's non-traditional work. And then there's also, with the rise of these platform apps, more and more people who are actually recipients or consumers of these services. If you've rented an Airbnb or taken a ride-hailing car. So this gives you a sense about this growing rise of what we call non-traditional work. And this is work that's short time, part-time, without benefits. So as I mentioned before, many agricultural and domestic work in the United States were done by Black and brown bodies. This type of work has always been precarious. But starting, I would say, in the 50s and 60s with the rise of the Kelly Girl and secretarial temp labor, we've seen more and more of this work that is fundamentally precarious, where you don't get the benefits and protections that you get around, from U.S. labor law, because so much of U.S. labor law, the benefits are actually only coupled with full-time employment. The United States and Turkey, by the way, are the only two countries that do that. So we're seeing this rise of this type of work, and more and more organizations are using this because it's a way to save costs. They don't have to pay the same amount of taxes. Companies are planning to bring in more of these workers, and we've got roughly 15 to 25% of North American workers, and that North America there means the US and Canada, who are being employed in these type of work arrangements. This is just to give you a sense of the numbers and how the numbers are on the rise. And lastly, I want to say, while we're seeing this phenomenon sort of increase in the United States and most of the global South, there's already this presence of informal work in the form of the informal economy. And independent workers typically fit in 4 segments. Folks who it's their free choice to be workers. You've probably heard about IT consultants who are like, hey, I'm a Ruby on Rails programmer. I want to work on a beach in Bali. But what's really growing are people who are out of necessity, who are doing this type of work and who are trapped in these jobs that I would say are structurally bad, and maybe they're underemployed, and they rather have types of work that are considered a good job or more stable. So I've already touched on this, some reasons why employers might prefer this type of work: more flexibility in terms of their labor costs. It's cheaper, both in the day-to-day level of not having to pay as much in wages, but it also means they don't have to do long-term planning around their workforce. But the consequences for workers are much more mixed. They're not sure if they really feel committed to the organization. There's a lot of psychological work that people have to do in making sense of their environment, who they want to interact with as co-workers. How do they create educational opportunities for themselves if they're not housed in an organization that provides training? And we tend to see these workers have more stress, more health problems. So there are issues not only with the workers who are in these types of work arrangements, but also for the standard employees who work with them. Think of a lot of companies, you've got a W-2 employee that's working side by side by an independent contractor. And this is some really interesting research that finds that individuals who are the standard W-2 employees are actually negatively affected by having these independent contractors, because it makes them feel like hey, my job is insecure too, and they don't trust these independent contractors as much, and they're kind of more concerned about their management structure and how they're being judged. So I think the long-term arc of what this research is saying is with these rise of independent contractors in the workforce, there are these short-term financial benefits that the organization saves, but there is a concern if they can ultimately be more costly because there'll be increased turnover, both of these contractors that come in and out, but also among their standard workers, and that's also tied to performance. So we've talked a lot about the people who actually do their work and their characteristics. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the when and where the work is being done. So two different types of findings I'm going to share with you, one around these rise of fluid work schedules and the other around remote work, or you've probably heard of digital nomads and how they rely on technology to work from anywhere, sort of like that Ruby on Rails programmer. There's a lot of research that's coming out on the 4-day work week. So that can both mean compressing work in 4 10-hour days, but more often it actually means chopping off 8 hours, typically a Friday, and then people working 4 8-hour days. There are a lot of experiments that are going on with this, particularly in small and medium-sized companies in the UK, Australia, France, Germany, and the United States. And surprisingly, very positive results, that having those shorter work weeks can really allow individuals to be more focused and get more done. And, this research is really around knowledge workers, but even around nurses where, there's you have to have workers that are on call for a longer period of time. The companies will have to hire additional staff to be able to, cover that gap in time, but they're finding there's less worker fatigue, less errors that people are making at work, more higher concerns around safety when you're able to sort of give people this shorter work time, and just also people are taking less time off, less sick leave and things like that, because they can concentrate any personal things on their 3-day work week. So this general sort of research is talking about rethinking the 5-day work week, which has probably really only been around since the 1920s or 30s, is actually having some beneficial impacts, particularly around knowledge workers and those who are higher skilled. The other change that we've been seeing around where the work is done is in the rise of remote work. So there's a long history around remote work and telework, probably since the 70s. A lot of that early research saw that teleworking could actually have negative impact on workers, more because they weren't as integrated in the organization, didn't feel such a strong sense of organizational commitment, they were left out of promotion discussions. But really what we saw with the height of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, was organizations shifting to allow there to be more remote work, and even organizations coming around to be remote first organizations. So some numbers around COVID, we saw a big chunk of the US labor force working at home, between 1/3 and 40%, and it was 2/3 of the US economic activity. So to help you interpret that number, that was pretty much everybody in the US labor force who could work from home was working from home. And it also gives you a sense about the economic weight that those individuals have, because they really were sort of the ones that are contributing the most to the US economic activity, i.e. they were high-skilled workers. These individuals were working much, much longer work days at home. You've probably seen some of the scary news articles that talk about, old people who had children were actually struggling with childcare and sort of how to balance that with their kids who were in online schooling, but also individuals who didn't have children that were taking on more and more responsibilities at work. And there's, a lot of scary stories about people passing out in Zoom calls or breaking their teeth because they started grinding their teeth so much for the stress. So we're starting to see these sort of negative effects from the longer work days. There was a productivity boost, but it didn't last very much. And this sort of ties to the next statistic, is that only about half of workers were saying they were able to be as efficient at home, as they were prior to the pandemic starting. And the more individuals seem to be sort of doing this fully remote work, the more this seems to have a dampening effect in terms of performance. So just to give you a sense about the world of remote work, it means a lot of things too, from being all individuals in the office, but some of the time for individuals being location independent. But all in all, this is sort of saying that the findings around remote work are mixed. So you might be thinking, if individuals are working more remotely, our manager is still important, because really independent work is really what is the best to be hived out for remote work, because individuals can sort of do what they want to do, sort of work their own hours and really be more focused. So this is research from a very large study done with thousands of workers on Microsoft. And what they're showing, and this sort of it has been corresponded by other research, is that during the pandemic, when remote work was at the highest, your ties with people who were close to you actually got stronger. But your ties with individuals who were further away, they're more on the periphery of your network, got weaker and weaker and weaker. And really that meant that middle management became incredibly important, because they had to fill these structural holes, because there was less bridging ties with individuals who were further away from your network. And so we see, particularly around middle managers, they're spending a lot more time, sending emails, having meetings, being on the phone and having IMs with individuals. And so while you think that remote work might be a time saver or a money saver, because you don't need middle managers in the same way, this research is showing that middle management becomes even more important as work becomes more and more distributed, because there's sort of this, they are the ones that do that information between individuals, between their boundaries spanning, between individuals who might be core to a particular project and those who are more on the periphery. So what the science suggests, if you're thinking about, in a company, how do you think about remote work and communications going forward, is you've got to figure out what worked really well. And do people really like remote work? Or how much was that about being able to do the work versus who they didn't have to interact with? How did the technology interact with? How did the technology interact with the way they were doing their work? And then ultimately, you have to create a policy that's has equity for everyone, because there really can be a tendency for individuals who are higher skilled to let them do more remote work and hive off, while individuals who might have be at the front desk or things like that to be in person, but that just amplifies any fault lines or divisions that are in your organization. So it's really have to be a much more centralized policy for deciding who gets to do remote work, as opposed across the organization, and not just letting local managers decide or making that a perk for one person or the other. So the next bucket or phrase around remote work is thinking about how the work is managed. And here we'll get a little bit more in the technology and how it's structuring work through algorithmic management, and also these new types of organizational structures called flat organizations. So typically, when you think of organizational structures, there's a hierarchy. You have your worker bees, you have line managers above them, middle managers above them, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And many companies are experimenting with ways to sort of flatten the organization. Maybe there are only 4 or 5 direct reporting lines that go up to the CEO. So Netflix is a huge proponent of that, having people who are independent contributors and investing them with a lot of autonomy. Zappos uses holacracy, which is another sort of mobile organizational structure where individuals are actually not told their roles in sort of a way. There's like governance rules that are set up by teams, and then individuals decide, okay, these governance rules talk about the different sort of tasks that are being done, then different individuals and groups decide what tasks they're going to do. And then when it's time for sort of roles to readjust, then they'll have a conversation across the different meetings that's a meeting about the task role. So the meeting about the meeting to decide how governance will be shifted. And then Hire is an incredibly large company. It's a manufacturing company based in China that uses these cross-functional teams as well as a ways to spur information sharing. So what to take away from this are these different ways to look at management structure behind hierarchy. Very much often use technology as being a core organizing principle, particularly using wiki pages as a way to share information, to upvote or downvote what should the rules be among these self-managing teams. And the latest iteration we're seeing around this are DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where you might actually not even know the face of who is the leader of these DAOs, but instead there are all these governance rules that individuals in the community buy into, typically with the tokens or things like that. They buy into this organization through the tokens, and then they have conversations about governance rules, and then vote or upvote on the governance rules and who's going to do what task to let this organization function. Now that's talking about how work is being managed at the human level, how humans are setting up organizations and using technology to create these non-hierarchical forms. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about using algorithms. So where you don't have a human as your boss, but you have an algorithm as your boss. So what is algorithmic management? It's basically a system where algorithms do anything that a manager is going to do. They're going to do the hiring, the firing, the evaluating, the disciplining, the rewarding. And this is a quote from Duggan. He's written a lot about algorithmic management, and he describes it as a system of control where self-learning algorithms are given the responsibility for making and executing decisions affecting labor, therefore limiting human involvement and oversight of the labor process. And in particular, we see this algorithmic management around the gig economy. TaskRabbit, Instacart, Uber, Lyft, Juno, all rely on algorithms to make their decisions. I actually worked for one of these companies for about 3 years, never talked to a single employee at the organization. All of my interactions were with the algorithm. And as I talked about earlier in this section, we're seeing a rise in this type of work. On-demand workers are also independent contractors, and having an algorithm as boss or as manager is a way to create more workers who have more distance and are more peripheral to your organization. So my research focuses on the on-demand economy. Probably my largest study is on the ride-hailing industry. And if you're a social scientist, same as me, and you've seen these sort of advertisements for these companies, and if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, is this really true? Do I get to be my own boss with Uber? Am I ditching the 9 to 5 by becoming a Lyft driver? And this is the research question that motivated my research. It's like, why do these ride-hailing drivers ride? Like, what entices them to do the work? And, the surface level answer I find is sort of schedule flexibility. But we all know they really don't have schedule flexibility. They have to be, if you're dependent on this work economically, and most people are, you've got to be out when there are people out. So that means you're often doing morning and evening rush hour, and you're working on the weekend. So it's not schedule flexibility, it's something else. So the research I did on this was actually my dissertation. And this is the project that keeps on giving, because I'm now in my 4th year, I think, post Ph.D., where I've done a fair amount, 4 years of observation as a driver and a rider. I've interviewed 136 drivers across North America, and this is longitudinal. So I'm checking in with these drivers, roughly every other year. I could talk a lot about sampling if you're interested offline, about how you can't actually do snowball sampling in this type of work because it's so deeply algorithmically managed. Most workers don't know any other coworkers, so they're very atomized in their work they do together. And then I collect a lot of secondary data, focus groups, observations, and guilds. And this is just my US data set I'll be talking about. I've also done projects in about 8 other countries looking at the ride-hailing industry, as well as projects on other things around the gig economy, but I'm just talking about the ride-hailing data right now. So I collected a lot of data, qualitative data, used qualitative techniques to analyze it. And I just want to give you a little taste of what the algorithms look like from the driver's perspective, because you've probably only seen it from a rider. So this is the work matching algorithm. This is in upstate New York. I know a place that Nanette is very familiar with. And it's showing that the ride is 12 minutes away. It's a 3-time surge price. Person has 5 stars. And that bar at the bottom, well, it's counting down. You've got about 20 seconds to accept that ride or not. And these are my notes from my very first field ride. First day, I'm sitting on a shady street 2 blocks from my house, nervously checking my phone every 20 seconds so I don't miss a ping. My phone is on my dashboard when it suddenly starts buzzing. Yay, a ride. I see a flashing circle with a timer counting down. My hands are sweaty, the phone is vibrating, and while trying to swipe, I drop the phone under the passenger seat. I don't actually say darn. After a few seconds, the phone goes quiet. I've lost my first ride. So here you see a bit of the tension that's just me and the phone and the app and the algorithm in the car, but I obviously don't know what to do. I'm losing my first ride because I'm just by myself, and as I'm saying, it's very socially isolating work. Your interactions with customers are very fleeting. And that day actually gets worse. I didn't know that I needed to buy a separate holder to hold the phone, and in particular over the phone vent because it was so hot in DC when I was driving. So my phone overheated multiple times, and I didn't know how to take people where they were going, and I was relying on their directions, and I didn't get paid fully for that day. But all of this is really just to show you sort of the tension, or what the heightened tension that happens when you're interacting with an algorithm that's essentially assigning you your task. This is the surge algorithm. You're also probably familiar or heard about this. This is a heat map of downtown Chicago. The darker the color, the higher the surge amount. You also get these very nifty text messages that say things like, demand is higher than usual in Center City. Take advantage of higher than normal fares. And when you open the app, this is before you leave a login, just when you open it, it shows you this heat map. So the algorithm is already there giving you nudges about where they think you should go to try to move you in that direction where there's higher demand. And Sarah describes, you turn on your app, and then you see that very orange, bright color around downtown. That means there's a surge. There's high demand, so you rush into that area. So what I show in this is a stream of papers that you'll be able to see on my website, is that these interactions with the algorithm at this human algorithm interface on the app actually create a sense of buy-in for workers, because they feel like they're going to have choice in that work. The choice is very narrow, but that choice is real. So there's a choice in what platform you're going to drive on, when and where you're going to start driving. That's what most of the research focuses on. But what this paper focuses on, or this stream of work, is around the work cycle. So you're choosing where to wait, you're choosing to accept or deny the ride request, you're driving to pick up the rider, you're starting the ride, you're maybe interacting with the customer or not. They typically have on headphones, but you're navigating with traffic and you're following the GPS, and then you're dropping off and rating the rider. And in that set of all these discrete actions, you're interacting with an algorithm at each one of those arrows, which I call choice points. And all these very small choices is that narrow but real choice that I talk about, that give individuals a sense that they're consenting. They're consenting to this larger structure of algorithmic management. Now, lastly, I'm going to talk about who helps with work. And I think this is really where a fair amount of the popular press we see around algorithms and technology is focused on. So the two biggest non-human actors that are helping with the work are robots and artificial intelligence. Many of you have probably seen this picture of, this is a robot that is being developed in Japan about how to give companionship to elderly people. That photo it has been staged by the company that developed the robot, and that actually it's not yet that advanced yet. It's still been in the prototype or developing phase, I feel like, for the past couple years at least. So we tend to see robots excel around tasks that are very easy to automate. So think about driving long stretches on the highway, or using a mechanical arm or a lever to pick up materials and move them somewhere else, which is, the lifeblood of what happens at an Amazon warehouse each time you're going to get those Prime packages. But at the same time, there are some tasks that are difficult, almost impossible to automate, where we're really not seeing robots being used. And that's, an example from the trucking industry is around the dropping off of freight. It's actually a lot of fine maneuvering that has to be done to back up the truck into a certain area and attach it to the loading dock. And the question is still out about tasks that are in between, like that last mile delivery that we're seeing those Amazon Flex drivers use, about, where can we have robots or some sort of automation coming in? In general, when we're seeing that when these robots are being added into work, it's not actually linked to an increase in the requirements of skill that are being posted for the job, surprisingly, and doesn't actually boost pay. So there's this larger conversation around robotics and are they augmenting or replacing workers? And in this example, we're not seeing as much of a benefit to the workers in terms of their pay of having robots being so deeply embedded into their work. We tend to see, I would say, more of the widespread conversation around this topic is around tasks that are becoming computer mediated, where we're seeing algorithms and technology and sort of providing advice or giving information to individuals. So very much where we're seeing a lot of AI being used is in terms of prediction and giving more information to expert professionals. They've probably seen the advances that have been having with AI and sort of helping do diagnostics on imaging and x-rays and things like that. As it relates to work, we're seeing AI really being embedded in different parts of the human resource cycle. So a lot of research has focused on hiring. Many of you might have seen the request to have more AI transparency around hiring decisions. Those are laws that are currently being in conversation in New York City and New York State. But there are companies like Plyometrics and HireVue that do interviews with workers in which they're looking at a person is being interviewed with this on a screen. So there's content that's being captured, but the screen that's watching them is also measuring, are they wearing glasses or not, or their facial tics, or if there's something on their hair, and then giving a score on the workers so that people who are on the recruiting committee can look at, not only the content of what someone's saying, but what is this score? As you can imagine, there are also conversations about how is that score determined? I think there's research that's been suggesting that individuals who wear glasses or hijabs or turbans tend to score higher with this score, but individuals who are transgender or non-conforming tend to score lower, in part because the algorithm isn't able to recognize their facial features and so neatly categorize it. So in addition to hiring, which also includes personality testing that Plyometrics does, it often has AI being trained on people who are star performers in a particular role. So are your best sellers the ones who are risk-taking or risk-averse? Are they extroverted or are they introverted? The AI will sort of create these personality tests for these high performers, and then these tests will be given to new individuals who are coming into the job to see, okay, what's the right job for them? What is the match in their skill set? Or not so much their skill set, but in their fundamental personality, because you can always uptrain around skills. And we've seen some really promising results, case by case with these companies about using AI in terms of how to make decisions around hiring. An example is around Plyometrics, which uses this personality testing. Their most famous test around risk-taking is you get to click a button to blow up a balloon. And that gives you a sense of how far will you click to get the balloon to get bigger and bigger. And that gives you a sense of what that person's risk-taking is. And then you can slot them for jobs of where risk-taking is more or less preferable. So they use this in the recruitment for, in bringing in their new sort of managerial class. And typically the company that they were hired to support does the reimbursement for the people who are coming to the newcomers that are coming to the company. They give them their moving reimbursements at the end. Once they're already in their new job, they file for reimbursements for moving. And they found, because of this hiring test, actually broaden the applicant and pool and who they hire to such an extent that they had to do these moving reimbursements before the individuals actually started at the company because they couldn't front the cost themselves. So just sort of in telling this story, I'm giving you a sense about how AI, in terms of hiring, created a broader applicant pool, a broader group of workers, in this case with higher socioeconomic diversity, that then, brought in a larger and more diverse, talented group of individuals into the organization. So this is a small story about how we see AI prediction, these learning technologies fit into hiring. But at each different part of the human resource cycle, we're getting algorithms that sort of augmenting human decision-making in lots of different ways. A few more examples that we're seeing this is in terms of language modeling. So if many of you may have been passively recruited by LinkedIn, and you might have thought they'll write you a note that say, hey, have you considered taking a job at company XYZ? You know, we think your skills would really be a great asset for this organization. And you chat back and forth and you say, hey, I've never thought about that job before. Can you tell me a bit more? You might have often thought you were talking to a person, you know, a person from HR in that company, but often those conversations are happening with chat bots. So LinkedIn in particular has technology that does more passive recruiting of candidates and then uses these chat bots to sort of develop the relationship. So another example about how in the recruitment process, AI, and particularly these language modelings, are helping at the intersection of diversity and who's being recruited into an organization. And lastly, this is a larger conversation that hopefully we can get into in the Q&A about AI. And you've probably all heard this saying, you know, garbage in, garbage out, and how different types of biases can arrive based on what the data is being trained on, and then what sort of information that's put in and what it's predicting from that output, and the sort of the learning cycle that happens there. And, you know, Kathy O'Neill has done a great book about weapons of mass destruction, and which really she focuses on the scale that AI is being used, the outcome, and how much opacity there is around what the algorithm is actually doing. Those three things really have an impact, you know, on whether or not these outcomes are having the intended positive benefits that we hope for, or something that we don't. So to sum up all the different ground that we've covered today, because we certainly have gone quite a distance, is we really drilled down on this idea of the future of work and what it means to different people, because these are really all intersecting components. So we started talking about who does the work, you know, and particularly the difference between part-time workers and independent contractors, because it's often individuals who are independent contractors who are being managed by an algorithm or in a more precarious situation. The next, we talked about when and where the work is done. More and more workplaces are experimenting with individuals having more fluid work schedules, so having more flexibility, both when they work and where they work, with remote workers being one of the most extreme examples of that, and these digital nomads who are able to sort of roam around the world and you know, do work whenever they like. We talked about also how the work is managed. So they're flat organizations. There's lots of different types of flat organizations, from Hire and Zappos to decentralized autonomous organizations. These organizations, which don't have traditional hierarchy, but you know, are more self-managing groups and self-managing teams, often rely on technology to help them, you know, do proper governance of their organizations. Another more extreme case of how work is management, extreme in the fact is if a flat organization sort of allows for more flexibility and fluidity, is algorithmic management, which actually sort of tightens up the control in a way, creating an iron cage or an invisible cage that dictates what workers do step by step, evaluating, hiring, and disciplining the workers. And there we went really in depth on the case of Uber and how they sort of give individuals choice in each part of the work. And that choice is given by an algorithm, which ultimately, you know, helps them further commit or buy into the work. And then lastly, we talked about who helps with the work, i.e. non-humans that helped. We talked about the role of robots, particularly in the transportation industry, and how we're sort of further along in thinking about how robotics can help us in sort of long haul delivery of maybe freights on freeway. But there are questions that are more, I would say, complicated about who's going to do last mile delivery, or who can hook us up to the loading dock, where robots actually can't fill in that step. And so we're seeing more of a reliance on human labor there. And then lastly, we talked about AI, very much important in terms of sort of knowledge workers and helping individuals make better predictions about what they're seeing, such as in the case of medicine. And in particular, in the context of work, how AI is being integrated from different parts of the process, in particular in hiring, but also in monitoring and surveilling workers. You know, anytime you're sending an email to someone in your company, that's often being stored somewhere in a server and being analyzed through, you know, big processors to see what is the emotional content of that email. What's the culture like? Does this person seem disgruntled? Are there information leaks being shared? So again, some of the power of AI and how it's being used in different ways at work. So to wrap things up, I want to say you've been a 5-star audience, and it's been a delight to spend some time with you today. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Please stay in touch if you have any questions, comments, anything you'd like to chat about.
Thank you for joining us. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A with you during your Institute panel this summer. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.